Hi, this is my colleague and co-teacher at Heartland Elementary, and her name is Melanie Treadway. And we're going to be discussing recommendations for mainstream teachers as a requirement of the EDU 583 course at Georgetown College. So Melanie, linguistics is a really broad topic, but today I'm just going to be going over the basics to make recommendations that will hopefully help you in your classroom.
Okay.
And please feel free to take notes as we're talking.
All right.
So I know that we both have taught ESL students, and I know you have a couple in your class now, but I just have to ask you if you're familiar with access testing.
I'm familiar, but not a lot of details.
Okay, so the access test is made by the WIDA Consortium,
Okay.
and it's designed to assess ESL students in listening, writing, speaking, and reading. It's really important to familiarize yourself with the student scores to know where they stand. And from there, you can use what are called the WIDA can-do descriptors.
Okay.
And these descriptors will break down what your students are actually able to accomplish based on their grade level, proficiency levels, and subject areas.
Okay.
And we can talk to our principal about maybe ordering these for every grade level, or you can always borrow mine.
Okay.
And the next thing that I wanted to mention that you already know is that it's really important to know about your student's home life.
Right.
So, for instance, I know that we talked about the student that I focused on for my project this year.
Right.
He actually speaks Quiche, which is a Guatemalan and Mayan dialect. But he does not speak that at home. Instead, he speaks Spanish at home and is learning English at school.
Wow.
Yeah, so in that unique situation, you kind of have to know where your students are standing, what they feel most comfortable with.
Right.
And it's also really important to continue to encourage your students to develop their native language. Research actually shows that students who are proficient in their first language are more successful in learning a second or third language.
Okay.
It's also essential to know more about your students' culture. This way you don't do something that accidentally offends someone. For instance, in some of our classes, we talked about hand gestures. I know some of my students this year are from a culture where standing up while eating is offensive, so I try not to do that around them. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And it also shows your students that you care about them if you try to embed their culture into the curriculum.
Yeah.
And also try to bring it into conversations with you and then with other students. And now we're really going to focus on the linguistics part of our discussion. So tell me if I go too fast or if you have a question about something.
Okay.
The number one thing I've learned this semester is that it's really important for students to learn language through genuine experiences. So instead about just learning about word study and appropriate grammar and phonics, they really need to be listening to conversation, participating in conversation, reading, using actual student writing samples. Even though word study can be productive, actually, in isolation, it's shown to not be very effective.
Okay.
So
that means like with vocabulary?
Right.
Let's talk about, okay.
So even though we want them to memorize a vocab definition, we really want, the end goal is so that they will be able to use that word in their language.
Comprehension and that kind of thing?
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. So also, teachers need to make a safe environment for students who are learning a new language, and they need to know that it's okay if they make mistakes. So something that we will see with our students is what's called a language ego, and it develops as they get older. So more like, I know we teach 4th grade. We kind of see that self-consciousness come into play now. So they're more aware of mistakes that they're making when they're speaking, which kind of makes them not want to speak as much.
Yes, I've seen that.
Yeah, so I know in the sample that we listened to before this video, my student was really reluctant to talk. And that's a really big signal of having that language ego and just being really nervous and afraid. So it's important that we make them feel safe. But it's also important that we hold all students to high expectations so that our students know that we believe in them.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you call the office when you get a chance?
Yes, I'm in the middle of something, though.
That's okay, thanks.
Okay.
Um,
You're just going to pick up from there?
yeah,
Okay.
I'll just cut it out.
Thank God. Okay.
Well, I lost my place here. Let's see. Okay, so it's important to have high expectations so that our students know that we believe in them and that they're pushed to do their best. And also so they have high expectations of themselves. Freeman, who is the author of Essential Linguistics, discusses why humans use sound to communicate. And he explains that sounds can be heard in the dark or from far away, and we can multitask while we communicate with sounds. So linguists have taken these specific sounds and classified them into different groups. So one category is called voiced sounds, and that's where sounds happen in the mouth. And vowel sounds, which we all are familiar with, consonant sounds, and blends. So in this book that I was talking to you about, Essential Linguistics, Freeman actually outlines the vocal tract to show the places of articulation. So places of articulation are places where your tongue actually hits a part of your mouth to produce a sound. So most of the time, it's a section of the roof of your mouth. And this is a diagram that Freeman shows in his book, only ours is not numbered. So I'm going to show. So based on this diagram and this outline of the vocal tract, how many places of articulation do you think there are?
I don't know, 4?
Okay, awesome. So there's actually 8.
Okay.
And I just wanted to show you that because there's so much that physically happens when we speak.
Yeah, you wouldn't think that.
Yeah, so it's really important for us to take our time when teaching sounds. And this leads me to my next observation that I've made throughout my coursework. So teachers really progress too fast when we teach phonics. So even though it's tempting to jump right in by teaching sight words, instead we really need to isolate those letter sounds that can help us with those words. And there's actually a number of ways, as I'm sure you're familiar with, to teach phonics and speech sounds. And they don't have to be boring. In fact, we want to try to make them really engaging. We can teach through nursery rhymes or speech topics through alliteration and tongue twisters. And because speech is so complex and because there's so much going on while we talk, there is innumerable ways to teach. So if you would like to get some more specific strategies from me, I can share parts of my Freeman book with you.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Or I can even make a list and share it on my blog with you.
Okay.
So
yeah, for some of my students any student that's struggling with that, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's great, too, about learning more about ESL students and strategies is that so many of the strategies actually apply to a lot more broad population of students. So, also, students need to make sure they have confidence in their teacher's grammar knowledge, which I know can be a little bit intimidating, but they need to know that they can ask their teacher why certain grammar rules exist. And because of this, it's important to know how syntax or grammar differs between cultures. So the student that I focused on this semester speaks Quiche. And in this student's language, instead of adding an S to make a word plural, he actually has to add an AK or TAQ or IB to make the word plural. So completely different concept.
Yeah.
And if I didn't know that about my student, it might be especially difficult to teach plural nouns.
Right.
And it's also important to know similarities in grammar or syntax. One example is my student in his language, he actually uses quotation marks the same that he does in English, so with direct quotes. And that's really helpful just to know for pacing purposes and also pre-assessment purposes.
Yeah.
And it's also really important to know phonemic similarities and differences. So in Quiche, there are more consonant sounds, and they're made with what is called a glottal stop. And this means that my student is restricting his airflow as he pronounces consonants in his alphabet.
Okay.
And actually, in my student's language, anytime there's a glottal stop, he uses an apostrophe. So that's why there's so many apostrophes in his language, because it represents that sound. So teaching apostrophes to him would be especially difficult.
So does he put it all throughout his writing, apostrophes?
Well, that's something that I noticed in my writing sample that I wanted to talk to you about is his use of apostrophes is really misplaced.
Yeah.
So that was interesting to see. And I just kind of wanted to touch on those examples so that you would be aware that if you are more familiar with the language, then you can notice those similarities easier.
Okay.
And lastly, it's important to analyze speaking and writing samples from your students. So if you have the background knowledge of your student's language, it will be easier, just like we had said before, to understand their errors.
Right.
And maybe also let us be a little bit more compassionate when learning a new language. So I know we looked at this writing sample from the student I worked with this semester. And because I've done so much research on this student's language and proficiency levels, there are several things I can tell. One is that my student needs to work on complete sentences. The other is subject and verb agreement. If you'll notice, anytime he writes the word friend, he leaves out an E.
Yes.
And he leaves out verbs. But he does have a good transfer of his ideas onto paper.
Okay.
Which in the speaking sample that we heard earlier, you can tell that there's that hesitance to let out his ideas. So one thing that I noted in my project while I was working is that if the student's language ego is getting in the way of him speaking, it might be better for him to have a writing journal.
Yeah. I can see that.
And so with these grammar errors that I noted, I used the book called English Brush Up to help me think of strategies to teach these grammar concepts to my specific student.
Okay.
So one thing I did is that when I was reflecting on run-on sentences, I was thinking about showing my students a complete sentence versus a run-on sentence, and actually showing them in a student writing piece so they can see that in context. And then also, when you're fixing a run-on, there are different ways to fix it. So one way is to add a comma and a conjunction. One way is to do the two separate sentences.
Right.
And the other way is called subordination, where you separate them. So what I would do is, once my student can recognize a run-on sentence from a complete sentence, I would have those strategies set off to the side and have him choose which one he felt comfortable with practicing.
Okay.
So that way, too, he's working for a true purpose, revising maybe his own work or another student's work. And it's not just learning grammar rules.
Okay.
And also with, as I was saying about him leaving out verbs, I think it's really important to talk about not only what a verb is, but how it can add detail to our writing, how it makes our writing better. And then to show samples with and without correct verb usage. Kind of the same approach to punctuation. Why do we use an exclamation point? When is it appropriate to use a period? And then, again, with the samples. And then, as you heard earlier in my speaking sample, we talked about the student's language ego holding him back from speaking. Right. For this student specifically, what I came to the conclusion of is that the only thing that eventually got him to speak was when he was asked about sports or his family. And when he was asked about those things, he opened up a little bit and started a conversation. You could tell he felt confident. So for that reason, it's also really important to incorporate our students' interests into their work.
Try to relate to them.
Exactly. So these are strategies that you know for every student.
Right.
But it's just especially important when they're learning a new language. So
I can see that.
The basis of the linguistics course is that you have to be familiar with your student's background, with their proficiency levels and their culture, in order to really teach them how to apply skills into their everyday life.
Okay.
And the other big takeaway to remember is that language is most effective when we use it in genuine situations. So not just a sight word match or
like
not
real world situation type of thing.
Exactly. Even if you wanted to pull aside a group of students and do a sort of role play conversation, that would be really effective.
And they'd like it more.
Exactly. And I know that was a really, really fast run through of everything I've learned in a whole semester for linguistics, but do you have any questions for me?
Do they struggle with adjectives, or have you not really seen that?
Yeah, some cultures more than others. I had a classmate this semester whose student didn't use any punctuation in their writing, actually.
Oh.
And so...
Well, I've got other kids that do that.
Yeah, we're familiar with that a lot.
Yeah.
But they didn't know how to use any form of punctuation, so that was a struggle. I can't remember specific uses of adjectives where they were
like I know Spanish
struggling.
flips them, you know.
Yeah, that's true. I do remember talking about that with my students, how instead of saying the blue notebook, it's like the notebook of blue. Yeah. Yeah, so I do remember that example being brought up. And I know that, too, you are relatively fluent in Spanish, which is great. I know most of our students here at Heartland, if they do speak a second language, it's usually Spanish is what we see.
Most common.
Yeah, and even just having the background we do of having those, I think we both took 4 years of Spanish in high school. Even just having those experiences is so helpful.
Right.
And so if we could just get a little bit familiar with each of our students' languages, it would take us that much further. So, yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for
appreciate your time. Yeah.
I learned some things. I'll have to get some stuff from you.
I hope it was helpful. Yeah, I look forward to sharing, and hopefully we can talk to our principal about ordering some WIDA can-do descriptors for all of us. So.
Sounds good. If we have money.
Yeah. Thank you.